Let's build on this fast boot experience a little bit. One thing that I noticed when I was looking at how the app worked is we ended up having to, so we've got this server-side data in Node.js land, and we've got this client-side data when we run in the browser. So how do we make these two worlds meet? So one interesting thing is that we can get data about a request, which is interesting. Like you can get a user agent when your app starts up. This is something that typically you would only have access to on the server side, but essentially because we're building this HTML on a per request basis most of the time, we can access the request object itself and get a header off of it. And so here's an example of how that might work. This would make this header data available as the routes model, and when that HTML renders, we would have that user agent rendered right on the screen. So you only have access to this fastboot.request object when you're rendering on the fastboot server. You need to pass that data to the client to make it available in the client if you are to use it there. And we have a means of doing that, and it's called the Shoebox. The Shoebox essentially is they're chunks of JSON. They get serialized into your HTML that fastboot renders, and then when the client side picks up and starts to take over, it will grab that JSON from inside those meta or script tags, and it'll give you the ability to access them by way of a service. So there are people that are already building nice add-ons on top of Shoebox that will basically capture all responses that come in, all data that's pushed into the Ember data store, write it out directly into the HTML, and then when the client side picks up, it'll basically take those records and push them into the store directly, which cuts down on duplicate requests, right? Because your data's, you already requested it in Node.js land, and your HTML lands, and essentially you're done. If you need more data, then you can ask for it as the user starts interacting, but you can basically settle having made no AJAX calls in your UI. So the general concept as to how you use it, you're going to want to use fetch instead of AJAX, instead of $.AJAX. Fetch is, again, the new web standard for requesting data that works equally well in the browser and in Node.js. There are a bunch of polyfills that people like to use, one in particular that is sort of built for Ember that works really nicely, and it's in this add-on called Ember Network. So the basic idea is you store data in the Shoebox, which is it is in memory, and then at the time that HTML is serialized out by the fastboot server, at that time it is written into the meta tag or the script tag, and then when the browser app starts up and renders on the client, that Shoebox data can be accessed. So a bug I've run into, it's not a bug, it's a snag, right? It's operator error. Remember that when you put objects in the Shoebox, they are written to JSON later. Meaning if you put an object in there and then you have a reference to it and you start modifying it, you may write something to the Shoebox that is different from what it was when you passed it in, right? So it's a good practice to kind of potentially clone things or serialize out strings or something that kind of freezes the data before rendering it out. So this is what a Shoebox looks like, at least in its current state. Pretty easy to figure out how it might work under the hood. We just grab it, get the JSON, do stuff with it. So here's how we consume it. The Shoebox is available on the fastboot service, right? So you'll have fastboot : inject.service, just like you would inject the store or something else onto an object. Then from the Shoebox, you can get a store, and a store corresponds to one of these blocks here. So for each store, you get a separate tag with separate JSON inside it, right? And that ID is part of what's generated, with the store's name in it. So you have to make sure that you you typically want to do two things. When you're rendering in Fastboot, you want to fetch some data and put it in the store. And when you're not in Fastboot, you kind of want to consume that data. You want to use it. So typically what you do is if you're in Fastboot, you're going to do something with Ember data, or you'll do a fetch, and then inside it you might, create the store if it doesn't exist yet and put a property there. And again, this line here, shoebox.put my store, shoebox store, like the idea of, this last line of JavaScript here, the one that has post.toJSON on the right-hand side. So you're just putting an object into another object. You're putting a value into an object. There's no listening here. There's no key value observable properties. If you were just putting like post itself there, it can mutate long after this code is run and screw you up. And the way that will be most annoying is if it turns into like a circular JSON structure where maybe like part of your Ember data record gets deserialized into client-side models where you have child objects that refer back to the parent, and essentially where you're trying to JSON stringify something that is recursive. Like that is something that can happen, and it is tough to track down, but it ultimately will come from something like this. So you see here, like writing out a string is a little bit safer than putting objects in there, because strings are immutable in JavaScript. They will not change. Any questions?
So you're doing this all in the model hook?
It depends where you might want to do it. So I occasionally use it in services. I might try to like restore data in an initializer or in an instance initializer, because it's pretty fast, like if the data is there waiting for you. It kind of depends on what exactly you're trying to do. But a route would be a place that you would see something like this.
So will you then guard again against if the shoebox doesn't exist? Then we are just going to use, then we're like working in dev mode and localhost, and we're just going to make a request to Mirage or whatever, how we normally would?
Yeah, so it's a little involved, as I guess you're seeing there. And this is why you've got like, Ed Faulkner has just Ember Data Fastboot, an add-on that does a lot of this stuff for you. Once you start explicitly using it, there are a lot of different situations you have to worry about, right? There's rendering on the server in Fastboot, rendering on the client, having been served up via Fastboot, and then like developing, which typically you don't develop with server-side rendering, you just do client-side rendering, in which case the shoebox doesn't exist at all. So there is some switching around here. Oftentimes, you don't need to do this for much, but it is extremely useful when you need it, particularly for things like the current user, right? If you have to like immediately after logging in, sometimes you just hit a static, like a fixed endpoint, just like who am I? And you get back a response. So it's nice to have that baked into your HTML, because that's usually very early in the critical path for rendering any screen, right? That's like application route kind of stuff. And if you can skip that, and if you can get that cached for that user, you're essentially just like whatever time it took to make that request, you can chop that right off. Those important metrics that we were looking at: time to first meaningful render and time to first interaction. And that's what you're wrestling with here. You're trying to get that Lighthouse score to 100, and they really want like 1.2 seconds that's the cutoff. You start losing points after you go beyond that. And the reason you do is, Google has seen that there's a big drop off in engagement if things take too long.